You're watching PowerNation. Today on Carcass, we have to make room for our drivetrain. We have a few modifications to help make our engine and transmission bolt into the subframe.
Then it's time to cut out the firewall and trans tunnel to make room for all that power. Plus, we'll show you how to measure for a set of custom wheels.
Hey everybody, welcome to Carcass. We have a big day planned in the shop today. We want to make our Road Course Camaro a roller, and that entails us putting the subframe underneath the car, but not before we set the engine and transmission in between the frame rails. But this isn't just a simple bolt-in deal.
And that's because we're going to set the engine and transmission back to help improve weight distribution of our car. We're going to set it back somewhere in the ballpark of 6 to 8 inches, and we're going to motor plate it up front to the subframe, and then we'll have to figure out some kind of transmission mount.
And that's not all the fabrication we're going to be doing. By moving the engine and transmission back, we're going to have to cut a big hole in the firewall. But really, the first step for us to get moving forward here is to just get the sling on this thing. We'll set it in between the frame rails. That's probably pretty good.
All right. Now we gotta go back. Backwards.
Backwards. Like way backwards. There. So like Jimmy had said, we are going to be running a motor plate in the front, and really all this is a giant piece of aluminum specifically cut to act as like a motor mount. In the back, we are going to be using the transmission mount. We just have to figure out where that lands. So for now, we're going to get this in between the frame rails, and then we have to figure out how we're going to mount this motor plate to the subframe. Keep going. All right, it's kind of resting there now.
10 to the bottom of the block. With that measurement, we can start making our cuts to the motor plate.
Okay, one reason why Jimmy took that measurement is because we need to pay attention to the bottom face of the engine block, or where the oil pan meets, to the top or the leading edge of the cross member. Now we're going to be running a dry sump oiling system, and we know the pan measures about 7 inches up here in the front, which is quite a bit different than a standard small block oil pan. So we want to make sure we have the clearance there. It's not too critical for us. We did move the engine back quite a ways. It's not really going to contact anything, but it's just a measurement we wanted to be mindful of.
And something else that we have to be mindful of is the bell housing and also the headers, which obviously aren't on it right now. But the more that we lower the engine, the closer those come to the ground, and we need to make sure we have a few inches between those and the pavement.
All right, and one thing that we did notice is the stock cross member for the transmission should work. All we've done is flipped it 180 degrees and put this mounting tab on the back. We'll just have to cut this tab off, move it to the front, and that should get us mounted on the transmission side of things. From there, we'll get the front and the back mounted.
Yep, I'll start making some brackets for the motor plate. To keep things simple, I'll go ahead and cut out the brackets on the plasma table. These are pretty basic, and we'll have 2 holes on each side to bolt to the motor plate. I'm just going to tack these brackets in for now, just in case we have to move things at a later time. I'll transfer punch the holes so we know where to drill in the motor plate.
Now that we know exactly where the front of the engine mounts, we know exactly where the transmission is going to mount. It turns out that we can still use the factory cross member. We're just going to come in here and cut the mounting pad off of the back of the tube, and then we're actually just going to reuse the tube itself for the mounting point. That just entails a couple quick cuts and a couple holes drilled. With the bracket cut off, I'll drill one hole for our new transmission mount. All right, let's see how this thing fits. If we like it, all we have to do from here is drill another series of holes in the subframe rails, and then it'll be mounted, so. Yeah, I like that. All right, that should work for now. The engine and transmission are in their final resting spot. So from here, we're gonna take a couple measurements because coming up, we're gonna cut a giant hole in the firewall. The subframe is mocked up and ready to go. But first, we have to make a little space to accommodate our drivetrain. All right, so now that we have the engine and transmission in the subframe, it's time to get this thing fit underneath the car. Now, since we've moved it all back about 8 inches, we know it's not gonna fit in the opening or the stock opening here on the firewall and in the trans tunnel area. So it's time to make this big cut. Now, we have done a little bit of measuring. We know that we're gonna have to open it up somewhere around 18 to 20 inches. Plus, we're gonna have to take some depth out of it as everything slides back. Our heads, our intake, our induction will now all be up underneath this cowl area here. So we'll start by marking a line. We'll get this cut out. Then we'll transition into the car and we'll start working on the trans tunnel. This is just a basic cut for now. Once we get all the engine parts on the engine, we'll make our final cuts. Okay, so we've got the major cut up here on the firewall in this trans hump area. Now we gotta work on cutting out the transmission tunnel itself. We have done some measurements and we know the back of the transmission is actually gonna land way back here in the car. That'll put our shifter in this location somewhere, and that's kind of ideal because our butt or our seat is now sitting back here versus where it was sitting up front before. Now, one thing to note, this is a subframe car and there is a giant cross member that runs right here. That's where the subframe actually mounts to. We can tell that because of these little plug welds or these factory weld spots in here. So once we get into this area and start making our cuts, we know we're gonna have to spend a little more time because we're gonna have to cut through that. It's not a big deal right now. We will come back and re-strengthen this back up. One major concern with that is we bolt the subframe under the car and we set the weight down technically on the subframe, it could really push the floor up in the air, so we have to do a bunch of supporting here when it comes to that time. We're gonna end up making our cut quite a bit higher on the transmission tunnel area. We're gonna leave this flange here and it's just gonna help us build our new transmission tunnel off of that. It gives us a nice flat spot to work off of. So we'll go ahead and lay a mark down. We're gonna start cutting, then we're gonna take this whole thing out as one piece. Somewhere in this area again, this is kind of all somewhat of a guess, somewhat of a mathematical line, but just a real basic cut. right, this is exactly what I was talking about. Now that we cut this giant cross member out of here, the floor has become extremely flexible. It's kind of lost all its rigidity. So we will have to come back and rebuild this a little bit later. One other thing to note is now that we have this giant hole in here, you can almost tell that the transmission is going to be a little too wide, especially back here in this cross member area. We may have to do a little more trimming, kind of come up in this area and maybe even just get rid of these flanges. But for now, what we're going to do is get the subframe up underneath the car, try to get it bolted into position, and we'll see what happens from there.
To mount the subframe in our car, we went to Summit Racing and picked up a set of these RideTech solid subframe bushings. These are made out of Delrin, so they're a lot stiffer than the stock rubber ones, and they are the stock height, so when you go to put your subframe back in your car, all the geometry and everything should remain unchanged. And why these are important for our car specifically is because in a race car, you want the suspension to do the work and not have any flex between the subframe and the body, so these are going to do a great job constraining everything. So if you need to mount a subframe in your Camaro, go to Summit Racing and pick up a set of these.
We're installing a set of Guniwheels to help us roll our subframe under the car. These have airless polyurethane rubber tires, can hold up to 3,500 pounds, and have a universal bolt pattern that fits most cars and light SUVs. All right, I'll grab the shifter in here. Let's see how close we are.
Let's see here.
Ooh, tight fit. Keep coming though. Wow. That's gonna be close right there.
Actually, we gotta come forward a little bit, so it looks like it'll fit.
That does fit. Wow, perfect.
All right, let's get this guy up to the mount holes.
All right, I got this one started.
Yeah, same here.
Get the back ones going too. All right, Michael, you can lower the car down a little bit now.
All right, that does it for the front. We're gonna move on to the back and make this thing a roller. Coming up, we show you what to look for when measuring for a set of custom wheels for your ride. To make our Camaro a full roller, we're gonna go ahead and put these hubs on. And before we get the other set of Guniwheels on, we are gonna measure for our actual wheels. So I'm just gonna go ahead and get this on here. Not gonna grease the bearings because this is just purely mock-up. This car will go together and come apart probably 3 or 4 more times. So just go ahead and get this thing buttoned up on here. Also going to put the drive flange on just so we get the right offset of the wheel. And the brake rotor mounts to the back of the hub so we don't have to worry about mounting the rotor hat or anything on this. We're going with a 3-piece wheel setup on our Camaro, and we want to make sure we get the specs right when we order it. And this is especially true if you are going with a more expensive wheel because you want to make sure you get it right on the first shot. So we went to Summit Racing and picked up this WheelWorks wheel offset measuring tool. It's easy to set up to your rim diameter and your width, and then you can adjust the center section to different backspace settings and put it on your car and test it. So I'm just going to put this up here and see where we're at. All right, so I kind of expected this. The tire's hitting the leaf spring, and that's where we're limited for this. So I'm gonna have to adjust this plate to give us a little bit less backspace and push the tire out. So with this tool, there's a couple bolts here that we just have to loosen up real quick. That way we can move the center plate, I guess, in comparatively to everything else. We'll get this up against the drive flange and we'll put some lug nuts on here just to secure it. And this tire now is sticking outside of the quarter panel, and that's okay because we are going to flare this a little bit just to get everything to fit. So what I'm going for here is just getting maybe a 1/2 inch off the leaf spring because this tire here is a 335. The one we will run is a 315, so it'll be a little bit skinnier. So I can just about fit my finger between the leaf spring and the tire, which is pretty good there. All right, so according to our tool, we're looking at 4 inches of backspace, but we have to subtract a 1/2 inch for that big mounting plate in the center. So our overall wheel size would be 18 by 11 wide with 3.5 inches of backspace. So now if you were doing the front, it's a little bit different because you have to run the steering through its full range of motion to check for clearance, and you have to have it at ride height, which is why the setup rods are nice, because we can keep the suspension compressed. Obviously in the back here, we're sitting up on the spring, but we're not too concerned about clearance vertically or in the wheel well. We're just concerned about clearance laterally to the leaf spring and the fender here. And just out of curiosity, it's probably sticking out about 1.5 inches, and we do have a way to take care of that later on. But for right now, I'll just get this off and get our wheels ordered.
Up next, we want a little more protection in case of an emergency. So we'll assemble a stylish rear firewall to give some much needed safety.
All right guys, we've got our Camaro sitting on the ground. It's basically sitting on its own weight now. So now we're gonna turn our attention to the inside of the car. We've cut the firewall for the front. Now we're gonna move our way to the back.
And what that entails is actually building a firewall in the rear of the car. What that's gonna do is gonna separate the fuel system back here in the trunk from us up here in the passenger compartment. That way, just in case there's a fire or a problem, gives us a little more time to get safely out of the car. Now, we're not gonna be doing it the way Jimmy does it with his CAD programs and the CNC machine, but we are gonna be using CAD. This is a little more old school. It's called cardboard aided design.
Kind of takes me back to kindergarten.
All 3 years?
All 3 years. At least I graduated.
Right. We'll do a base cut in here somewhere, and then we'll come up here to try to follow the wheel tub, something like that. The best part about using cardboard is it's easy to make adjustments with, plus if you screw up, you can just grab another piece. That fit pretty good on my side.
I'm pretty good on mine.
Okay, so I think from here then we'll build out the framework. We'll use some square tubing, build the framework, build kind of a package tray, and then we'll come back and finish these pieces off in steel.
All right, sound good.
We're gonna use a piece of 1/2-inch square stock to build out the framework for our firewall.
Before Jeremy can put the rod in place, I'll go ahead and prep the area for welding.
All right, we'll cut a vertical here. Let's go 14.
14, yeah, looks good. Go.
We'll trace our patterns out on a piece of 16-gauge sheet steel and then just trim it to fit. All right, we'll do a little test fit here. Then I've got an idea how to give this thing some style. Yeah, that fits really good. All right, let's give it some style. You may have seen this on the car before, but to give it some style, we're gonna be using dimple dies. We'll start by cutting some holes in the firewall that match the size of our die. Then head over to the press and add the dimple. We got these from Rogue Fab, the same place we got our tube bender. We'll use these little covers here. We'll cap this off that way. It can still be a functional firewall. All right, we'll do one more test fit here. See how this looks. Yeah, that looks really good. Now all we have to do is repeat the process on the other side. Not only do the dimple dies look cool, they also add strength to a flat piece of steel. All right, guys, well, we have all the pieces made in the back here. We even made this top plate. We're gonna call it our package tray, and that pretty much buttons up this rear firewall.
And what that's going to do is in the event of a fire, it's going to allow us more time to exit the race car safely.
And now we can get these panels out, get everything prepped, and then tack it in.